Hello, and welcome to 2-Minute Talk Tips. I'm Bill Monroe. This week's tip, slides do not equal time. How often have you heard somebody ask, how long is that presentation? Only to have somebody else answer, oh, it's about 15 slides long. That really doesn't give us any information. You may hear it asked the other way, too. How many slides ought to be in a 15-minute presentation? Is it 15 for 1 minute per slide? 7 for maybe 2 minutes a slide? Maybe it's 3. And do those slide counts include transition slides and end slides and title slides? Different folks are going to give you different answers. Sometimes folks will just look at a deck and declare that it's too long for a presentation, but don't trust that. For example, turning an eye chart slide into 4 individual slides doesn't lengthen your talk. It just makes stuff more legible and effective. Replacing 10 text-based slides with 4 powerful graphic slides doesn't shorten your talk. The fact is, slides are a poor proxy for the amount of time in your presentation. You should have the number of slides you need to support the points that you are making and the information that you share. The time in your presentation should be tied to the content that you are covering, not the number of slides in a PowerPoint file. Don't let the clock drive the number of slides you have, and don't let the number of slides you have drive the clock. Stick around, and after the break, we're going to discuss how to talk less and say more. Planning on talking about the idea of focus for a few days, because oftentimes speakers want to cover as much as possible in their limited time. We get excited about all this information that we have. We get excited about all of these points we want to make, and we want to share all of that with our audience. Unfortunately, that's usually a mistake. The more you cover, the more you can confuse and distract an audience, and they end up leaving with nothing instead of leaving with everything you wanted them to have. This weekend in late March, we actually got a powerful example. Emma Gonzalez spoke at the March for Our Lives. She was one of the survivors from the recent mass murder at a high school in Florida. And she had a presentation slot on the stage in front of a national audience. What she did was to speak for just maybe 2 minutes. And during that time, she named all of the murder victims from the shooting. And then she went silent. And she stayed silent until she hit the 6-minute and 20-second mark. So she was actually silent for well over 4 minutes. And it took a few minutes for the crowd to catch on. As she stands there, fighting back tears, sort of looking forward, you can hear the crowd first be supportive, worried that she lost her place or got too nervous to speak. And then you could sort of sense the confusion coming off of that crowd. Some folks started cheering, and then they stopped, and everything got a bit more uncomfortable. Her total time was 6 minutes and 20 seconds, which represented the amount of time that the murderer was running around the high school killing kids. She chose that crowd-confusing, uncomfortable silence to make a powerful emotional statement about something needing to change. Look, regardless of the politics at play and how you view the question of gun control, it's still an impressive example of talking less to say more. I'll post the CNN YouTube video of this talk over at 2minutetalktips.com for episode 55. If you click through to YouTube, as always with YouTube, I encourage you, don't read the comments. In the past, you've heard me talk about using silence and repetition to drive your point home. They're powerful rhetorical tools. And yes, they do cut into your time. Yes, you do cover less material. Yes, you do talk less and say fewer words. But by the day after your speech, typically, folks may only remember 25% of what they heard, if that. It becomes your job as a speaker to make sure you are deciding what 25% they are going to retain. And you can do that through powerful repetition. You can do that through the use of silence. Covering more points, covering more stuff, reviewing more material, and throwing more and more details at your audience does not help with that retention. You're just throwing out more and more trivia that then your audience has to try to retain among everything else that they are trying to retain and that they are trying to learn. It's not going to help them remember, but emphasizing the right stuff will help them remember. Part of this challenge of figuring out what to talk about and trying to talk about everything starts when we ask ourselves or when we ask our bosses, what should I focus on? The answer we get way too often is everything. The problem is that when we focus on everything, we focus on nothing. Everything cannot be a top priority by definition. When we try and give everything the top emphasis and make everything as important as everything else, nothing stands out and our most important points will actually get lost. It sounds like it makes perfect sense right off the bat, and it does, but it's still a tough lesson to learn. It's one that I've struggled with for a long time and that I still struggle with today. It's why the original recordings for each of these episodes are typically 50% longer than the final version, because after I record it, then I go through and I cut out a bunch of stuff. And in fact, even before I started recording here, as I typed up my outline, I cut an informal book review and a page of other notes because they weren't going to be quite as effective. With the theme of talk less, say more, I was even going to draw comparisons to the hit Broadway musical Hamilton, but ultimately ended up cutting that to allow deeper discussion of other elements that were going to be more relevant. See, in any talk, there is a temptation to cover as much as possible. We're excited about this stuff. We know this stuff. But we've all been in that presentation when the speaker runs short on time. And then they start blowing through their slides very quickly. They start really just sort of tapping on that next slide button and talking about each of those slides for 5 seconds or so that by the end they can say, yes, I covered all of the material. And technically they did speak to all of those slides and they did cover all that material. But did anyone retain it? No. And instead, in their rush to get through as many slides as possible and to just drop as many bullet points on top of the heads of the audience as possible, they wasted critical time that could have been spent covering the most important stuff, reviewing key points, reviewing calls to action, reviewing the most important material they were there to talk about that day. As a speaker, work to shift your mindset from covering to teaching, sharing, or persuading. So how do you do that? You start with the basics. Before you get up on stage, before you finalize your slides, before you begin creating the content itself, start with asking yourself, why are you going to be speaking? What is the point? Why should the audience care? And what do you want them to do? What is your call to action going to be? And why should they do that? Write those answers down. This the core of your talk, and let that be your guide. And as you review your content, ask, how does this piece of data, how does this discussion topic drive towards my call to action? If the answer is it doesn't, then cut it. If the answer is, Well, it kind of does, but it's not real strong. Cut it. If you're on the fence about it, cut it. Talk less so you can say more. Get rid of the weaker stuff so you come back to your theme more. One of the most powerful lessons I had to learn about editing wasn't about a speech. It actually came from a video project that I did with John Clark from Caffeinated Comics. John and I and a bunch of our friends got together and we filmed a short movie in the early 2000s called The Zany Boys. It was a funny idea that asked, what if a comedy duo had two straight men? And by straight, I'm not referring to their sexuality. I'm referring to their role as being the one who receives the joke from the comic. That would be a lousy comedy duo, but that was where a lot of the humor in the bit would come from. We shot a 27-minute film. We had all sorts of actors and different locations, and we put a whole bunch of stuff together. The problem was that when we got to the final thing, it was terrible. There were lots of good bits in there, but they didn't end up serving the story overall. And it was quite a shock. Ultimately, John went back and cut it and trimmed it and re-edited it, and it went through a few different stages as it got shorter and shorter and shorter. And by the time that 27-minute film was down to, just over 6 minutes, then it was funny. The thing is, you have to make sure that all of the material that you have supports that central point. The extraneous stuff is not going to help you. The secondary stuff is not going to help you land that point with your audience. Keep the strongest point and repeat them so they stand out. You have a goal, and everything you do in that talk needs to drive to that goal. It takes work to trim stuff. It takes work to cut. It takes work to trust the silence and to trust the repetition. But you do have that desired outcome. You have a reason for being there. Make sure that everything that you say drives you closer to that goal. Cut the extraneous stuff. Talk less. Say more. So that's it for this week. Go ahead and review your next talk. Can you cut 25% of the material and still make your point? If so, cut it and make your talk stronger. Do you have any stories about how cutting words, points, or slides made you more effective? Go ahead and tell us in the comments for episode 55 at 2minutetalktips.com. Do you think this episode might help a colleague, friend, or relative? Please share it with them and help them subscribe to 2 Minute Talk Tips in their favorite podcast application. Next time you're planning a talk, don't let the clock drive the number of slides or the number of slides drive the clock. And of course, as always, don't get best, get better. Thanks a lot, and I'll talk to you next week.
Two-Minute Talk Tips is a proud production of the Currently Speaking Podcast Network.